Okay, I have 8 o'clock. Let's go get started. So we've got basically 2 little things to finish up from last week for, I guess it's chapter 14. And after we finish up those 2 things, then we'll jump into the brand new material for chapter 15. So, one of the things that you were exposed to if you were in the real estate finance course is this concept of incremental cost of borrowing, okay? Well, here we look at it a little bit differently in that course, we didn't really consider income taxes, okay? And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna kind of work it as if you know nothing, okay? And sort of start from scratch. So, the context of this is one of the things that you may be faced with is if you're going to do, let's say, renovations on a property, then you could go out and get a brand new loan and then pay off maybe your existing loan, okay, on the property. Like, for example, you know, you bought a property, you've owned it for several years, you have an existing loan on the property, but in order to maybe do renovations, it might just be easier to get one singular loan that covers not only the renovations, but also allows you to pay off the existing loan. Does that make sense? Okay? So what we're trying to do here is look at what is, and the key word here is incremental cost of borrowing, all right? In other words, how much more or less are we paying for this extra $100,000 that we're going to be borrowing? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, we already have an existing loan of $150,000 with a monthly payment of $1,000 a month, and then we're saying that 5 years from now, the balance on that would be $125,000. Okay, and then on our new loan that we would be seeking, it would be $100,000 more, or have a balance of $250,000 with a monthly payment of $3,000 and then a balance of $180,000 at the end of year 5. Okay? Now what we could do is we could kind of look at each one of these loans separately and then look at them together. Okay? So what we want to do first, if we don't really have to do it this way, but I want to just sort of walk you through it. So let's take a look at our new loan here first and figure out what is the implied interest rate on that loan. Does that make sense? You're given basically 3 of the 4 variables, okay, or actually 4 out of 5 variables. You're given obviously a balance or a present value. You're given a payment. You're given a balance at the end of year 5, and you're basically saying the term is going to be 5 years. So what is the implied interest rate on that? Now, the key here, and this is where the whole business of the pluses and minuses matter with regard to how you put this in. So think about this for a moment. Once again, it's kind of cash inflows and cash outflows. We're sort of making the assumption we're getting the loan now, so that is, in essence, a cash inflow to us as the borrower. So in other words, the $250,000 is going to be put in as a positive number. We're going to be making payments of $3,000 a month, so that's going to be a negative to us as the borrower. And at the end of 5 years, we're going to have to pay off this balance of $180,000, so that's also going to be a negative to us. Okay, so let's just do that real quick. Once again, 12 payments per year. Good.
Would N be 5?
Yes.
Yes, or 60.
60.
Either way.
N06?
Yep. Okay, so that would be for the new loan. The existing loan, basically same procedure.
You know, I was trying to solve that last night, and I couldn't solve it, and it was because the balance at the end has to be negative.
That is correct. That's why I said it definitely matters. Okay? Okay, so we end up with there. Whoops, yeah, that's a little term, don't forget that. Okay. So, before we even go any further, is it really probably a good deal for us to get this extra $100,000? Probably not. Not if we're going to increase our borrowing cost that much. Okay, if our existing loan has got a 5% interest rate, basically, the new loan that we're seeking, although it's a larger dollar amount, is at 10%. But what's really going to be kind of blowing our mind is what that incremental cost is. And that's where we sort of take a look here at the bottom piece of information. Okay, so here we have 100,000 as the difference, or the present value, a $2,000 difference as the payment, and a $65,000 difference as our future value over 60 months. Okay. So basically that extra $100,000 that we're borrowing is really being lent to us at a cost of about 19.8%, okay? So what that means is to borrow that extra $100,000, we're really paying an interest rate of around almost 20%. So we would probably be better off keeping our existing loan and then going out into the market and probably trying to find another just $100,000 loan at a much lower interest rate than 19.85 instead of merging it all together in this particular instance. Does that make sense? Now, it's not always going to work out that way. That's kind of the whole point in sort of working through this. That sometimes, in other words, bulk doesn't always get you a better rate, is what I'm saying. Okay? In other words, borrowing more money doesn't always get you a better rate than what you would have gotten had you simply taken and gotten two separate loans. Okay? So it's something just to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Okay, moving forward.
You can use that same calculation for refinance. What else?
Well, I mean, that's pretty much the reason you're using it, is
right.
For refinancing.
For refinance, okay.
Okay? Now, with that, okay, so we've got 19.85%. that is our before tax cost or incremental cost of borrowing. Okay? Now, one of the things that we had, I think, we've discussed, but I want to make sure that it's flowing through and you're processing it. What is one of the key things that you get to deduct from your income tax? Interest expense, okay? And so what we need to do is we need to figure out roughly what is that benefit or what is that cost, if you will, of your income tax, or what is the effect of the income tax, and what is that going to do to your actual cost of borrowing, okay? So in one sense, you know, this can kind of be a bit counterintuitive, but you actually get a benefit, if you will, tax benefit from borrowing, because you get to deduct that interest. Okay, does that make sense? Conceptually. All right? So what we have to do is look at, well, what is that after-tax cost? Well, let's say that our interest rate, or not interest rate, but our income tax rate is 28%. All right? So if we've got an income tax rate of 20%, 28%, what are we going to have to do to adjust that before tax cost to make it an after tax cost? Okay? You're going to take the before tax cost and you're going to multiply it by 1 minus
28%.
the tax rate, okay, in order to get your after tax. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's just sort of plug in some numbers and sort of show you what we're talking about. All right, if our before tax cost is 19.85% and our tax rate is 28%, just to be consistent, okay? All right, so that is going to mean it's going to be 19.85% times what? 72%. Okay? Or 14.29 or 3%. So our after-tax cost of borrowing is going to be roughly 14.29%. That's our cost of borrowing, after-tax cost of borrowing, okay? This is why, that once again, a lot of companies will take on extreme amounts of debt, okay? And whenever they may not even need to take it on, because the cost of borrowing is, in many cases, going to be really low because they're getting this effect of the income tax on that cost of borrowing, because it's letting them basically deduct all of that interest expense. Does that make sense? Okay? All right. So that's that. Okay. Moving on. The new material for today.
This is quiz 5.
That would have been quiz 4.
That, yeah.
In the quiz 4.
One question before you go on. Just the rationale. Why is it that the future value is negative? Because
you're paying it out.
You're paying it out.
In other words, think of it like this. You're getting, let's say whatever the dollar amount was, $100,000 today.
You
okay?
get it. So
you're
that's
getting
possible.
that, I'm receiving that.
Right.
Over the next however many years, 5 years, you're making payments to the lender
Right.
for whatever the payments are.
And then you make
And then
the
at the
final
end of
payment.
5 years, you're going to make the final sort of balloon payment to the lender, which is also going to be a cash outflow.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so this chapter
Should be.
is entitled Financing Corporate Real Estate. Yep. Yep. But the bulk of what this chapter really deals with are some of the issues related to leasing versus owning real estate as a corporation, okay? So that's the title, Financing Corporate Real Estate, okay? The question is, do you want to lease the corporate real estate or do you want to own it? You know, and what are going to be the benefits and the cost of each one? Does that make sense? Okay, so part of what we're going to be doing in terms of the calculations is comparing the leasing cost versus the owning cost, and the leasing benefits versus the owning benefits. But before we get into that, what are the motivations for a corporation to potentially own real estate?
Or cost?
Okay,
Potential future.
okay. Well, your book is like 4 different reasons, okay? One is they're going to be using it in the day-to-day operations of their business, okay? So it's going to be an actual useful asset to them in the day-to-day operations of the business. Okay, so keeping it in sort of in that context, okay, if they're not going to be using the day-to-day operations of their business, what other reason might they invest in real estate?
Tax benefits.
Diversify, okay? In other words, they want to own something that maybe is not part of their core business to basically diversify away from what might be seasonality, what might be, you know, the inherent risk of whatever business that they're in, and so they're going to own this real estate as sort of a separate sort of investment, okay? So that'd be another reason, okay? What else?
Growth, future growth.
Okay, they might need the real estate for future growth, in other words, for acquisitions, okay? And looking at, you know, the future of what they may need, okay? They may not use it right now, but they may be buying it, you know, obviously, and holding it for some future. And one of the probably the type of players that fits perfectly within that category are grocery store chains. In many cases, grocery store chains will buy the land for their future grocery stores many, many, many years in advance of when they'll actually start construction, because they are trying to acquire it as low of a cost basis as what they can, until obviously the area becomes more fully developed. Then they can go in and obviously with that much lower cost basis build what they want to build. Okay, all right. Any other reasons?
Lease out on unused portions, offset the cost.
Okay, that's a possibility as well. I mean, in terms of you know, trying to use maybe excess capacity for, you know, and generating income from that.
Tax deduction.
I'm sorry.
They can use leverage as like the actual asset for getting loans, mortgages, financing.
Okay, that's a possibility.
Tax deductions.
There could be some tax benefits, but it also may be that they're owning something, and the reason they own it is maybe it was part of their core business at some point, but now maybe that's not really needed, but they're keeping the land just in case. Sort of like, for example, like a manufacturing facility, okay? That maybe they were in the business of manufacturing, whatever it might have been, and now all of a sudden they're saying, okay, we're no longer maybe in the manufacturing business, or no longer need the capacity that we once needed, but we're going to hold on to that real estate with the anticipation that we might need it, or it is simply, you know, an additional sort of investment for us. Okay. Now, having said all of that, with these sort of different motivations, can you think of a type of real estate where it's really hard to separate the business of the real estate from the actual physical bricks and sticks associated with the real estate?
Storage.
Or housing?
No. No, there's one property type, and let's see if you can make this.
Residential?
No,
Say it again.
no,
What was the question?
okay.
Trying to copy.
what is probably the one real estate property type that you have the most difficulty separating the ongoing business value of the real estate from the physical bricks and sticks of the real estate?
Office.
What?
Industrial. No, the single user, SAVS? No?
Are we on
I'm just curious, if anybody, obviously no one's kidding, I'm just curious.
Manufacturing.
Golf course?
Hotel?
Okay, what?
Hotel?
Hotels,
There you go.
okay? Why? You knew the answer, but why? All the other possibilities were already exhausted.
So you didn't realize there's a follow-up to that, did you?
I know because the business is hotel, so.
The hotel.
Okay. So yes, hospitality or hotels, resorts, that sort of thing, it's really difficult because there's so many different pieces with those types of businesses that, because you've not only got the rooms they're renting out, but all the ancillary services that they may have on site as well, and other, sort of, either restaurants on site, you've got spas on site, you've got, all this different stuff, all of which creates revenue streams that's not necessarily tied 100% directly to the underlying real estate value, okay? And so it's a real difficult and or very unique challenge to actually value, basically, hospitality product. And as a matter of fact, what you will probably see, most developers tend to stick with, one or two property types. In many cases, it's one property type. And whenever you look at usually hospitality developers, that's usually what they stick with, because it's a very complex sort of property type, and it requires a whole different set of skills than you're probably going to see with just your traditional kind of retail center or office building or multifamily project, that sort of thing. It's just being much more intensive in terms of the management and the operations and the integration of the business. Okay, does that make sense? And just out of curiosity, any of you have any interest whatsoever in that aspect of the development industry? Yeah. So a couple of you? Okay. Well, it's interesting because this past week, we had a meeting with a company called the Insight Group, which is based in Fort Lauderdale. They're the folks that own the Be-Ocean sort of brand, and they're actually looking for basically folks to obviously hire their organization. And there are a number of positions they've got. They came to us to talk to us a little bit about our program, kind of what we might be able to help them out with. But it's an interesting thing because their whole focus is literally the repositioning, redevelopment, new construction, everything as it relates to basically hospitality and resort product. Okay, so just something to think about, all right? Now, getting back to specifically our topic of this sort of whole lease versus own and kind of what are the motivations of owning and that sort of thing. If you were a company, you're trying to make a decision, should we lease our property that we have in this case we're talking maybe a single user, okay? Something like a CVS or Walgreens, that sort of thing. What kind of things would you consider when trying to make the decision as to whether or not you would want to lease that property or you would want to own it?
No, actually, you want to be with the real estate.
Okay, in what way?
Meaning, if I'm leasing it, I don't have any headaches. I don't have to worry about paying any bills. If I'm leasing it, I just cut one check every month and everything else is taken care of.
Not necessarily.
Well, I mean, if you're leasing it, typically the owner is going to be responsible for the maintenance aspect. And everything.
Not necessarily.
No, if it's triple net.
Not if it's an absolute triple net, we're going to talk about.
Which is strange.
Good comment. I'm sorry, what was it? Okay, what are your actual out-of-pocket costs for the leasing? What are your actual out-of-pocket costs for owning? Okay. Well, yes, but that's one of the differences between residential and commercial. With residential, yeah, your leases are maybe a year at a time. But with many commercial leases, you know, a standard lease might be 5 years, you know, 3 to 5 years. We're just like a small little retail or office tenant. But for larger scale tenants, those lease terms could be 25, 30 years or more. Okay, so there it's not, you know, an easy sort of move out situation. You're stuck there for the next, you know, 15, 20, 25 years, especially with like grocery store chains that may not want to, if they don't build and own their own sites, they may simply, you know, want to engage in that long-term lease because they're going to have a lot of equipment that they're going to have in place. You know, they don't necessarily, it's a massive cost to pick up and move. Okay. Other sort of thoughts on the whole leasing versus owning?
What's your strategy as far as from a company standpoint? Do you want a bunch of retail space, or, you know, versus if you know you're going to be selling more online, you want to, you know, go down in space?
Okay. Yeah. You make you know, if you had been one of the major retailers and you knew there was going to be this intensive, you know, competition emerging, you know, online, would it maybe have made sense for you to have sold off a lot of your core real estate and, you know, in terms of the physical bricks and sticks space, and then maybe lease it back, you know, for shorter duration so that you wouldn't necessarily be stuck with that property, you know, in the long term. So that's a possibility as well.
Just like sneaker lease, you just
Right.
walk away.
Right. RJ?
I was gonna say, you basically have the ability to do whatever you want with the property, maybe as far as renovations
In what
go.
way? In which type?
I guess retail.
No. What I'm,
Owning, you have the flexibility to do whatever you want with it.
see, that's another sort of misnomer. Residential is a whole different animal because residential, yeah, you rent an apartment, no, you can't go in, knock down walls, put in, you know, new furnishings and fixtures and that sort of thing without potentially having problems with your property owner. But with commercial properties, it's quite standard to literally, you take an empty box and then you go in and you do what you want to that empty box, and then at the termination of the lease, in some cases you may be required to turn it back into an empty box. Okay? That, in other words, you know, whatever you put into it, you know, whether it's you're upgrading the lighting, the air conditioning systems, the flooring, whatever you're putting on the walls, whatever electrical features that you may have in the property, all of that may be required to basically be converted back to. So it's not necessarily going to be the same with a lot of commercial properties as it is with residential in terms of your control, if you will,
Yeah.
over the property.
What if you added value to it though? Like, why would the owner want to decrease the value by?
Because maybe those features that you put in might not be appropriate for a future tenant.
Yeah.
Like, for example, let's just take a simple retail property. So, you know, a common retail tenant, you know, like in a strip center or shopping mall, might be a hair salon, okay, or a barber shop, okay? What are they gonna have in their space that probably most other tenants aren't gonna want or need?
Chairs.
Not just the chairs, but more
Sinks.
permanent. All the sinks and the plumbing that they're gonna have for washing people's hair and all that sort of stuff, that you know, they may have a dozen sinks with plumbing, you know, everywhere to accommodate that sort of use. Well, what future retail tenant is gonna want all of that in their space whenever they come to occupy? They're not. You know, they're gonna want all that totally, you know, out of there by the time they come in and take over possession of the space. Now, in using like office space as maybe an example, that may be a little bit different. But, you know, let's say that, you know, you've got a law firm, they move in, they subdivide everything into nice little private offices for their attorneys, but then a future office tenant might come in and say, we're all about open floor plans. We're all about basically cubicles and you know, everybody being able to see everybody and you know, all that sort of stuff. So, you know, a totally different type of finish out. Okay? So, you know, the mindset of the property owner, you know, in many cases is, look, I don't want all of the stuff that you put in there, you know, at the conclusion of your lease, because it may make the property more difficult to actually lease to somebody. Okay?
A company will consider leasing because when they own, it's on the books, right? But when they lease, if it's an operational lease, they might put it off the balance sheet, even though now the rules have changed and they're gonna have to do it regardless, even if it's a capital lease. I'm sorry, even if it is an operational lease.
Tax
Okay, let's stick with yours just for a moment. Okay, so financial lease versus an operating lease. What is the difference between the two?
It's how you report it.
Okay,
Long-term versus short-term?
that would be one way to sort of think of it. The financial lease typically is a more longer-term obligation.
You're using financial for, instead of, in lieu of capital, right?
Capital lease.
Capital lease,
We can call it financial lease, capital
Okay,
lease,
okay.
this.
just to,
But the idea is that you have more of a financial stake in that lease that is more difficult to get out of. And it's typically going to be viewed almost as a debt obligation on the part of your balance sheet as a company. Now, as you said, things have changed, over the years. We have the whole Enron debacle that happened, many years ago, and that, we had this piece of legislation that came out of there, the whole Sarbanes-Oxley, which, then began to have us look at, what are really these operating leases and how are they different from financial leases, and are you really being, who's really being obligated to what and under what conditions? Well, let me kind of, for those of you that don't have any idea about what that sort of means, let me kind of give you a short little primer to give you perspective. All right? Think of it like this. You have a parent. And I'm going to use the analogy kind of a couple different ways. Think of it as a parent as in a parent company, but you could also think of it as a parent of children. Okay? And it works both ways. All right? So you've got this parent. All right? They have basically subsidiaries, if I can spell that, otherwise known as children. Okay, whichever way you want to use the analogy. Okay? All right, so there's number 2 and number 1. Okay? Child number 2, so to speak. All right. Now, clearly, if the parent goes out, the parent company goes out, and they borrow money and buy a building, that debt is on their balance sheet. Yes?
yes.
Everybody understands that? Yes?
Yes.
Now, if a child goes out, or a subsidiary company goes out, and they buy a building, is that going to be on the parent's balance sheet, or is it going to be kept on the child's balance sheet?
On the shop.
Simple answer is it depends.
Because you need to have safety, the parent co-signing on that.
That is the reason I'm using this analogy, okay? It may very well be that the child doesn't have the ability to get the loan on their own without the parent co-signing the loan and taking on the financial responsibility in the event that something goes bad. Does that make sense? Now, in the absence of the parent co-signing, then, the subsidiary to a certain extent is kind of on their own. Okay? And potentially, obviously succeed or sort of fail on their own. But is there, potentially the possibility that even without the parent co-signing, that somehow the parent could still be held financially responsible for the actions of the children? Well, in some cases, yes. But here's what I guess I'm trying to point out here is you were having companies that were basically creating all of these sort of subsidiaries and saying, all right, we're going to set them up as these independent subsidiaries. They're all going to get all of these loans on their own. But what they were doing and the way that they were structuring this was in a way where it made it look as though the parent was not going to be responsible. but ultimately they were. Okay? And it's kind of like this, that, let me try to give you the best example analogy that I can give you. You go to get a car loan, okay? And once again, you're the child, all right? You go out and get that car loan, but your parent co-signs, okay? The key word is just they co-sign, all right? Now, the question is, how is that co-signing even recorded? Other than just, yes, with that lender, it is recorded. But overall, does it somehow show up on the parent's credit report? Well, that all depends. In some cases, yes. Some cases, no. Depending on, once again, kind of how it's structured. And so my point with this, not to belabor it, was that you were having these situations of where the parent was being obligated to all of these sort of transactions, but it didn't appear that they were going to be held liable, but ultimately they were. Okay? And they were sort of hiding their liability by basically sort of hiding behind the subsidiaries and not really, you know, it didn't look as though they had as much of an obligation in terms of debt or financial obligations as what they really had. Okay? That's the bottom line. Okay? And so, but part of their motivation for creating these subsidiaries was it was a way for them to access more and more and more capital than they could have just as the parent. Does that make sense? Okay. That's all I really need to say about that, but this feeds into this whole thing of kind of the financial lease and to a certain extent the operating lease, that the operating lease was meant to be sort of a short-term kind of thing that would not inherently impact your balance sheet because it was seen as a very short-term sort of financial obligation, whereas the financial lease was seen as much more longer-term obligation, more like a debt obligation, okay?
4 criteria.
But go ahead.
May I? Okay, so there's 4 criteria between a capital lease and an operating lease. If the lease is 90% of the value, then it's a capital lease. If the term is 75% or greater of the useful life, then it's a capital lease. If at the end of the lease there's a change of ownership or there's a bargain price at the end and sell short of the operating value, then it's a capital lease. If not, it's an operating lease.
But now that's changing, so everything is gonna be, operational.
Okay, that is how it is now.
That's how it is now, but I mean, that's changing. There's a new regulation coming in where they're gonna make you have everything on the ledger.
Yeah, yes. And that's what I was trying to say with this, is that at the end of the day,
That's what blockchain.
what is happening and what has, you know, finally sort of taken hold is you're no longer going to be able to hide these things.
Right.
Okay? That you're going to have to basically put out there, yes, we have all these leases in place, yes, we are financially obligated to each of these, here are the terms and conditions, and they're no longer going to be this kind of subsidiary, hidden kind of liability. I'm sorry?
Off balance sheet.
Off balance sheet financing.
They're trying to get to the international financial accounting standards, but they've been talking about that for 6 years.
Okay, so let's move on. All right, now, all right, we said that for a lease, what is tax deductible? No, for a lease.
The expense.
The lease payment. The lease payment itself is fully tax deductible. Okay? Not just like an interest or principal sort of thing, just the full lease payment is tax deductible. Because you're renting, that lease payment is tax deductible. Now this is, once again, only applies to property that you're obviously leasing for business purposes, not, you know, property for your own personal residence. All right, so the lease payment is deductible. What else is going to be deductible? As it relates to the real estate. Okay, operating expenses. okay? Because you as the tenant, depending on how the lease is structured, are going to be either partially or fully responsible for operating expenses. Now,
You're talking about commercial, right?
we're talking about commercial, okay? On one side of the continuum, we have what I would call an absolute triple net lease. Okay? On the other side, I would have a gross lease. Okay? The gross lease, this is what I would call an all bills paid by owner. Okay? You simply pay one check to the owner, and the owner takes care of everything as it relates to the property. They take care of the operating expenses, they take care of the taxes, the insurance, maintenance, utilities, everything, all inclusive, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, this is tenant pays everything. Okay? Now, I want to make sure that I'm very clear. An absolute triple net lease is different than just a regular net lease, okay? An absolute triple net lease is, like I said, probably the most extreme that you could go. This is the type of lease where you typically are going to have a standalone single tenant building, like a CVS, a Walgreens, you know, some sort of a drugstore, maybe grocery store, but some sort of standalone sort of box tenant. And we'll talk about how they may build the space, but then ultimately they're going to lease that space maybe for the next 20, 30 years, okay? But whenever they engage in this lease, they have an owner that is simply going to want to collect checks, okay, for the next 25 years. And that owner really is not going to have anything whatsoever to do with that property. They are simply a financial investor, okay? The tenant, CVS or whoever, is simply going to take care of everything. If the parking lot needs to be resurfaced, the tenant's going to do it. The roof needs to be replaced, the tenant's going to do it. If it needs to, the building needs to be renovated in some way, the tenant's going to do it. Okay? Everything is going to be done by the tenant. Now, in exchange for that, it's going to probably be a relatively low lease rate per square foot because, once again, the landowner, the property owner's not really having to take care of anything. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Now, so in this case, an absolute triple net lease, the tenant, they're going to obviously be able to fully deduct whatever their lease payment is, and then also whatever those operating expenses are associated with the property. Okay? Make sense? All right? Now, if you own the property, what do you get to deduct?
Operating expense.
You may have some operating expenses that you get to whatever's not being passed through.
Interest.
But the mortgage interest is the big thing that you're going to get to deduct. But somebody said it, depreciation. Okay.
Improvement?
Are going to be the big three. So you're still going to have some operating expenses this is as the owner of the property. You're going to be able to deduct the interest portion of your mortgage payment, and you're going to get to deduct, for income tax purposes, the depreciation on the property. Okay? Does that make sense? That would also be included as well, assuming you have those. All right. Now, let's see. So let's do this, do a couple little calculations. say that we've got some annual lease payments. Keep the math or keep the calculations here a little bit simpler. All right. In our annual lease payments, we're going to start off, and now do we have potentially any investment that we might have to make up front whenever we lease the property? Well, we might have some sort of tenant finish out expenses that we have. So there might be some sort of cost of occupancy that we have to take into consideration, whatever that might be. So let's just say that we've got $100,000 of occupancy cost that we've got to put in. Right? And that, in this case, our cash flows are going to be, let's say, $30,000.
This is from
Correct.
What is the 100,000 in the beginning?
That's going to, this, once again,
Occupancy cost.
in this particular case, we're looking at this from the owner's perspective. Okay?
Oh,
From the owner or the?
In this case, we're looking at it from the owner's perspective.
okay.
Okay, so here we've got $100,000, and that we're gonna have to pay upfront. Maybe, once again, renovation, initial occupancy cost, where we wanna refer that to. And these are gonna be our actual lease payments. Now, in this case,
When you say owner, you mean the owner of the business or the owner of the real estate?
real estate, okay? So, once again, these are gonna be our, from the owner's perspective of the real estate, they're gonna have cost of occupancy to get the space ready for the tenant of $100,000, and they're gonna collect $30,000 a year for the next 5 years, okay? So the first thing we want to do is to calculate basically what is gonna be the internal rate of return for this scenario. So one payment per year. We put this in as either a cash flow, or we could put it in as present value, but we wouldn't put it in as a cash flow just because you might need that.
And why would you be putting this 100,000 not the tenant? You could use for like they're building up their space or whatever.
It may be that you're in a particular point in time where, in order to attract the tenant, the only way to attract them into the space is to agree to pay for some of the upfront sort of finish out costs. Okay?
You going for IR?
Yes. $15.24%. Okay. Now, you could have done that, obviously, a couple of other different ways. You could have put in the $100,000 as a negative present value, put in $30,000 as a payment, and put in 5 years as your term, solve for the interest rate. You could have also put in the $100,000 as a negative cash flow, put in the first $30,000 as a cash flow, and then put in 5, shift in sub J, and then solve for internal rate of return to shortcut the process, okay? So at least 3 different ways you could have gotten to that answer, all right? Okay. Now, let's assume that we're gonna look at this as if we would be owning, right? so in this case, initial outlay, let's say of 125,000. All right, and the cash flows that we're gonna have, maybe, let's see, a little more, so 35,000.
And what is the difference here? If the one is the owner's perspective and this is owning?
Okay. All right,
Is this the same problem? Just looked at it from different angles?
two different angles.
Okay.
Okay, so in this case, if we fully own the property, then our out-of-pocket initial costs are gonna be 125,000, which may represent not only the cost of occupancy, but also maybe a down payment, something of that order. The cash flows that we've got here are going to represent, obviously, the expense. Let's see what we get.
So it's just a different example. There's no theoretical difference between.
No. Okay, so this, the first one, this is the after-tax cash flows from leasing. This is the after-tax cash flows from owning.
That's basically to figure out, do I want to own or do I want to lease?
Correct.
I see.
Okay? And then what we're gonna do is that we're gonna take the difference between the two and to see, in essence, what is going to be basically the after-tax internal rate of return of leasing versus owning.
So the 15.24 is what you'd be paying to an owner, and the 12.3 is what you'd be paying to the bank. Fine.
One way to potentially look at it.
Okay.
Okay? Now, let's do this. Take the difference between the two. So 25,000 and $5,000 a year. Okay? Once again, so this is going to be $25,000 more. All these are cash flows again. Okay.
Are you putting the 25,000 as a negative?
In this case, yes. Okay. So in this case, you're getting basically, that's not, that can't be right.
Zero? You get zero, right?
Exemptions will work out precisely how you want them to. Okay.
Well, I'll get 100 for this.
Say it was $36,000.
Well, yeah, we changed the numbers up a little bit. Well, in this case, basically, there's no significant difference.
That is actually, but that's actually the concept. That is actually the point of indifference.
Right.
If you actually gonna lease it, and that's what you're gonna get, or you're gonna own it, that is the, you have to get a better lease
Right.
in order to go on with it. That's the point of indifference.
In that scenario, you might as well lease them, because there's no benefit to own.
Right.
Exactly.
Simply put. Okay. I just wish it had been an actual.
Moving forward.
I mean, it's correct. It's just, I wish it had been.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple other concepts.
Hold on one second, Dr. Floyd. So you're saying like at the end result, if since the IR for owning it is lower than leasing, then leasing would be more favorable?
Right.
Then,
Might as well, there's no other additional benefits.
But what,
Okay,
when you
It's basically the same cost.
right. I'm sorry?
No, it's,
Okay.
There's no difference, but I want you to own it.
Well,
Tax,
it depends on what your ultimate objective is. In this case, there's no clear, the point of indifference simply means you are indifferent either way.
all the
You
things
don't really care.
equal.
Because in essence, the benefits to owning, the benefits to leasing under that simple set of cash flows, there's really no difference.
In other words, financing doesn't make any, it's not gonna push you one way or the other. There gotta be other factors that, then you can make a decision.
because there's risk to owning it too, so why
Right.
take the risk if
Right.
there's no benefit, no premium?
It's just gonna ultimately come down to then a personal decision as to which one that you're gonna think is the best strategy for your organization and why.
You plan to be
In other
there
words,
forever.
the financial analysis is saying you're indifferent,
Right.
but there may be other intangible factors that are gonna push you one direction or the other.
In reality, I mean, if you got the zero, but in reality, if you're owning it, you're probably gonna put in a lot more than a minimal incremental difference. So, but you're also getting more rents back, so maybe you don't
Right.
have that additional cash to purchase your phone.
Okay. One of the things that is a little bit of a challenge to kind of come to grips with is, as we were sort of saying, with like hospitality properties, sometimes separating out the real estate value from the business value. And also, if you are owning the real estate and you are occupying that real estate and you're running your business in that real estate, what could happen over time is the value of the real estate has gone up dramatically, but the value of your business has gone down dramatically as well. Okay, or not as well, but obviously the value of the real estate's gone up, the value of the business has gone down. Okay, and how do you sometimes separate that out in the sense of knowing when it's a good time to get out and to sell versus holding on to that property? Okay, we talked about that whole marginal rate of return business last week, but also think about it like this. One of the things that can happen is you have an operating business that may still be making money, and you have real estate that you're occupying that you have long since bought and paid off, and you are sort of having to make a determination, kind of, do we continue to operate this business? The business is still making money, but yet you're maybe not fully realizing or recognizing the underlying value of the real estate, okay? In other words, simply put, is the business worth more dead than it is alive? Okay? I mean, think about that. If you've got the underlying real estate that the business occupies that's worth a fortune,
Sears,
but the actual business itself is pretty much worthless.
Sears.
Okay, yes, I agree with you, okay? But the point being is, you know, they own a lot of real estate
Right.
and have owned a lot of real estate. you know, would they have been better off, you know, many years ago spinning off that real estate completely, you know? Like, for example, one of the types of firms that sort of predated, you know, well, not predated, but certainly was one of the first types of companies to have a lot of real estate were railroads.
Yep.
Okay? And many of those railroads realized the value they had in the real estate versus the value they had in the actual railroad. Okay? Because one of the things that whenever railroads, you know, were initially built, the federal government in many cases gave them alternating swaths of land. So you had like these 640 acres of land on one side of the track, and then they would give them, once again, an alternating 640 acres on the other side of the track. And the idea was that that would give value to the railroad for future development, that they could build hotels on that part of the land, but yet this piece and this piece and this piece would be held back and then ultimately sold to private individuals, okay? But the idea, well, what you end up having were these railroads that owned massive, and they still, many of them still do, but through, in many cases, through basically businesses they've long since sort of spun off into sort of real estate development divisions, where that along those lines, that in many cases then, you know, use that 640 acres to, you know, develop on. Now, my point with saying this is that they made the right decision, I think, in many cases, spinning off that into almost like a totally separate operating business. But you have a lot of these retailers today that said, oh no, you know, we're not going to do that. We're just going to stay in business, and we're just going to basically bleed out the business until it finally just dies completely, okay? And, you know, you may have had other firms over the past, maybe manufacturing firms, that owned their own buildings, their own manufacturing facilities, and for whatever reason that good or service was no longer needed to be produced, but you know, they own the real estate, and you know, difficult to try to separate out, once again, that real estate value from the actual operating business. All of that to simply say this: in many cases, part of the problem was that real estate on the books would be held at book value, okay, from an accounting perspective, all right? Well, what is book value? Book value is pretty much the historical cost.
What they paid for.
What they paid for it. Well, if they paid, once again, they've owned it for 50 years, or 100 years, or whatever it might be, that original sort of historical cost or book value may be negligible, okay, you know, almost nothing, all right? And in a lot of cases, for many years, that value was sort of a hidden value. In the sense that a lot of folks maybe didn't really appreciate or sort of recognize how much value was maybe tied up in the real estate and how much it really contributed to, you know, the overall value of the company. Because in some cases, the companies did almost try to hide it from the standpoint that they did not want to be seen as being like a takeover target for, you know, some other, you know, entity to come in and say, okay, look, you know, this business that you've had is a dead and dying business. We're going to come in, we're going to buy all the stock of this company, and then we're going to shut the business down and then sell off the real estate. Okay? And then put all the workers out of work and so forth, so on. And, you know, we could argue the finer points of, you know, is that ethical? Is it, you know, the appropriate thing to do, and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, you know, one has to, I mean, you know, I don't think any of us ideally want to see all the employees that work for Sears to be put out on the street and say, okay, you no longer have a job, you know, working at Sears. But
that's where they're going.
The inevitability is, yeah, that they're probably all going to be out of work within a matter of a few more years because the business is not a viable business. But yet they have all this underlying real estate.
A lot of viable businesses that are active now, like Costco or Publix and all this stuff, they're under danger in 5 or 10 years. They could be in trouble because they hold a lot of assets, real estate, and they'll be in the same situation as Sears.
Well, in some cases, that's part of what I'm trying to kind of explain, is that many retailers have taken the approach of, we don't want to own the real estate because we don't want to end up in this situation. We simply, want to engage in these long-term absolute triple net leases, and then at the expiration of those, if our concept is sort of dead as a doornail, the only real, assets, we really don't have any assets left, so to speak.
Index leases, right? They call them index leases?
Well, index is where you're tied to some sort of an independent, like a consumer price index or some other outside third-party, rate as to what your actual lease payment's going to be. But that's different than what we're talking about here. Okay.
So you were talking that this was the way that it was done before. Is it done? It's right now, when we look at the stock of a company, is that stock reflecting the true value of its real estate?
In some cases, yes. In some cases,
So
no.
it's still
There's still elements of this that are
hidden from the investor.
and also, this whole thing of kind of residual value of the real estate that, it may not be really reflected in, what the company's sort of balance sheets show.
That's why they're going towards getting away from historical costs and going to fair market value, where they have to reevaluate all their assets at the end of the year. And there's a balance sheet account, I forgot what it's called, but that's where they have to put their plus or minus, basically.
Yeah, because this whole idea of this residual value, a lot of folks will argue that it's basically irrelevant for corporations. Because if you're an ongoing business, the real value of that real estate, it may be hidden. If you're going to continue to occupy the space and you're going to continue to own the space, then it doesn't really matter.
It only matters if it only matters if you sell it.
Right.
But at the time
But
that you
if
sell it,
your intention is to never, ever, 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 ever sell, okay, then, is that residual value really worth anything?
right.
You follow what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
To a certain extent, it's almost like, like the federal government is not a business, but yet you could sort of say, they're not going to sell off, what one would think, certain assets that they have in their possession. The idea is they're going to hold them, into perpetuity, okay? And one can make a similar argument about some corporations, that there are maybe certain core assets that they own that they're never ever going to sell, and if they're never ever going to sell them, then it doesn't really even matter what that underlying value, quote unquote, is. Do we really care?
What about automobile manufacturing facilities that close? Do they own real estate, like GM plants?
In many cases, yes.
Is that
Absolutely.
all of this?
Yeah. Okay.
Now, when they get liquidated, when they get liquidated, like a company like that, it's a fire sale
Yeah.
or the stock.
Right.
The real estate is also liquidated as a fire sale, right?
In most cases, yeah.
Depending on the law.
Yeah, because in many cases, you may have a facility that's outdated, that is, got environmental contaminants on site, that, there's a whole litany of things that could be, problematic, with that property. And they don't really even get identified until after that owner has basically left the building, literally.
So let's assume you have a triple net lease or with a CVS, and CVS is going out of business like Sears. So wouldn't you want to be Sears and have the land that you can use for something else versus just lose the business?
Okay, one more time, I'm not sure I understood that question. Okay.
Okay, so the owning versus leasing, that if CVS starts going out of business,
Okay.
And they have a contingency of a 30-year lease,
Okay.
let's say they're at year 10,
Okay.
they're going to have a cost that they incur because they're going to go out of business. But Sears has the value of the land that they can develop or use or sell for something else, so what do you want to own?
The problem is, or part of the problem is, making the conversion from that operating business, for Cedar specifically, into something that is foreign territory to them, which would be
Development.
the development. I mean, it's
I mean, but they can sell to that.
they could, but at the same time,
They're liquidating.
there are many other issues sort of swirled up into that. I mean, think about it like this. Let's assume for, I mean, I'm really not trying to go down this road too far because it's really not completely germane to what we're dealing with, but assume that you worked for Sears, okay? And all of your friends work for Sears. You work for Sears your whole career. And all of a sudden, you see your employer, Sears, selling off all of these assets, and what are they doing with the money? Are they giving it to you as the employee? No. They're taking it and potentially distributing it to the shareholders, okay, cashing out. And so, you know, there's going to be that, you know, whole philosophy that they've got to have. Are we simply going to sell off everything, cash out to our shareholders, put these hundreds of thousands of people out of work pretty much immediately? You follow what I'm saying? The social cost that they're, you know, trying to potentially evaluate is part of it.
But the same thing happens with like the CVS. Everybody goes out. I mean, the employees.
Yeah, but there they don't have any assets to sell at this point.
Yeah, so wouldn't you rather have the assets?
No, not really.
Not necessarily because it's such an extra burden.
If interest rate goes up, the property value comes down, and you lose money on both sides.
Because there they can simply say, okay, our lease is up and done.
It's not their area.
I mean, a lot of this, you know, it gets into more of the behavioral sort of stuff and the sort of social issues and all of that kind of stuff, which is beyond the scope of what we are really, you know, concerning ourselves with. Okay, moving forward.
So from this, we just learn hidden value or residual value.
Okay. Now, one of the things in terms of financing real estate for corporations, they could go out, they could get a mortgage. Okay? They could also issue debt if they're a large enough corporation. And by debt, we're talking about like corporate bonds. Okay? So they've got at least two different sources of capital. No, they can also issue more stock. Or equity. But let's just focus on these two for a second.
What is that? How corporations raise money?
Yeah, for real estate specifically. All right? So I'm a big corporation. I want to go out. I need to buy a manufacturing facility. Or I need to buy the land for a manufacturing facility, build a building on manufacturing or for manufacturing on that piece of land. I could go to a bank. I could say, okay, this is how much money I need. This is what I want to build. They're going to give me a mortgage, just like we've talked about, you know, endlessly, you know, in terms of you know, what a mortgage is. Or the new piece of information we're sort of introducing here is they could issue corporate bonds, okay, which basically are publicly traded in many cases, so that you can go online and you potentially could buy, you know, corporate bonds for a whole variety of U.S. corporations, and those bonds can be used for a whole variety of things, but in this case, they're saying we're issuing these bonds to build this big new facility, okay, so right with me. Now, my question to you is, which one should they do? It depends on what though?
The cost.
Cost, very simple, okay? Because it could very well be, if you've got a very high credit rating as a major corporation, your cost of issuing debt could be substantially less than the interest rate that you would have to pay on a mortgage. Does that make sense? Plus, with a mortgage, you're going to have a lender sort of looking over your shoulder, so to speak, with regard to the operations and kind of a lot more sort of potentially in your face than what the bondholders might be, okay? But the bondholders, to a certain extent, as long as you're paying them what you owe them at any given time, they're probably going to leave you alone, okay? And not necessarily get involved in any sort of real oversight. Now, historically, one could have made the same argument about lenders, but that's not necessarily the case anymore. So my point, the simple point, is it could be less expensive to issue debt in the form of corporate bonds than it could be to get a mortgage. Thus, maybe the reason why, that if you look on the balance sheets of a corporation, you're not going to see any mortgages. It could very well be that everything that they've done has been through the issuance of corporate bonds. Okay, does that make sense? Yes or no?
But
And what is the-
flip side, the rates are too low on the bonds, people might wanna buy them, so they have no choice but to get the mortgage.
There's also that as well. Okay. But in many cases, it's going to be, you know, a risk-return relationship in the sense that if you've got a very high credit-worthy
Right.
corporation, there are people that are going to be chasing that. Okay? All right, moving forward.
And what's the difference with issue stock equity?
I'm sorry?
The third one?
Yeah, this would just be issuing additional shares of common stock in the corporation.
But that would dilute the
The ownership.
Right.
Okay?
We're not equity.
That you should see the parallels between this and just real estate in general, because this is no different than really saying we're getting additional investors. We're getting additional money from investors to put into the deal. Okay? Whereas we're just issuing debt, we're basically leveraging up the company. Okay? All right, moving forward. All right, let's see here.
Before you,
Yep.
what's like a, I guess like an ideal capital stack where you would see something like that, like, let's say like, a lot of times we use like, a certain amount of debt, a certain amount of mortgages, and maybe a certain percentage for equity. for the deal.
Once again, totally depends on the company, okay? But that's actually what we're about to talk about, is the weighted average cost of capital, okay? And specifically, what are going to be the components of that? So we briefly mentioned this before, the weighted average cost of capital. And if you're looking at this from a corporation's point of view, it's very similar to, once again, kind of from a real estate point of view. You've got, obviously, equity. And you've got debt. And, you know, the question Jarvis is asking, you know, is there sort of an ideal sort of proportion of debt versus equity, you know, in a particular deal? And, you know, from a real estate point of view, in many cases, you know, we want to keep that percentage of equity, you know, as low as possible. So this might be 30% equity, 70% debt. Now this is something that we have a fair amount of control over as a corporation or as an entity that is seeking to fund their operations or to fund real estate. And that we've got to make a decision of, do we go with that sort of stack? Or maybe just the opposite? Okay? So if this was, you know, option number 1 versus option number 2, and then maybe we even got a third option that is 100% equity, which one is going to be the best for us? And it's not necessarily, there's not an absolute right or wrong answer. It's a question of what is that cost of equity? What sort of rate of return do those equity investors want? What is our cost of debt? How is that structured? What sort of tax benefits do we get off of that? You know, so there's no one ideal sort of capital stack. And so and the reason these are called capital stacks is basically you're sort of saying, at your base, you've got your equity, and then on top of that, we're stacking on top of that debt. And now we could have multiple sources of debt. We can also have multiple sources of equity, okay? In this very simple scenario, we're saying we've got one source of debt, one source of equity, okay? Does that make sense? Now, to Jarvis's point, you know, is there an ideal capital stack? And there really isn't without, obviously, more information. That it could very well be that we've got equity investors that don't really demand a very high rate of return. They could be a nonprofit, okay? Could be a government entity. Could be, you know, just a high net worth individual that really doesn't care about the return. They're more concerned that the project gets done, okay? Does that make sense? Okay? But you could also have a situation of where you've got equity investors that they're chasing every possible dollar that they can get and want to maximize their rate of return, which probably reflects the majority of the market. And then they're going to be also then chasing, well, what is the lowest possible cost of debt? Okay, make sense? Okay, now, what we have sort of demonstrated, I think, previously, you know, this whole weighted average cost of capital, that it's going to be, you know, dependent on kind of your before tax and your after tax cost of the debt and the equity. So if we've got, you know, if this is, in essence, our loan to value ratio, but then we've got basically our cost of debt being, let's say, 10% on a before tax basis. All right? So just knowing that, and we know that maybe the overall project, let's say, is yielding, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
The overall project yield is maybe 15%, then we should be able to sort of back into what is, in essence, our return on equity for that particular capital stack. All right, and how we're going to do that is as follows. Okay, so here we're going to have the 70% loan to value, which is going to mean, obviously, the 30% over here. So all I'm doing is just kind of bring down those numbers. All right, and then our cost of debt is going to go here. In this case, 10%. And the overall project yield, or our weighted average cost of capital, is, let's say, 15%. Then what we should be able to do is find the missing piece of information, which in essence is going to be our return on equity. Does that make sense?
Is that plus or times?
Times. This times, that is times. And this is plus. Okay? All right? So, in doing this, this is basically going to be 7% or 0.7. And that's going to leave us with, if 15 minus 7, that would be 8 over here. And then back into, so it gives us about 26.6 or 27% as our return on equity.
How did you get that 8?
Okay. 15 minus 7 gives us 8. Okay.
And the 7?
Well, we get 7, 70% times 10% gives us 7%. Okay? And then to get the 26%, all you're doing is taking the 8% divided by the 30% gives you the 26.6. Okay? Now, so, very basic math, okay? This would be like grade math. Okay.
A long time ago.
Okay. Now, with that, this is just simply saying that our return on equity would be that. Now, if we started out and we knew what our required return on equity was, so let's say that we start with saying that we have investors that that maybe they're not gonna require 26%, that maybe they're only going to require, whoops, wrong pencil. Maybe instead of this, we say they're only gonna require 20%, okay? So what we can do is take the 20% times 30%, that's gonna give us 6% down here. So 6 plus 7, that means that we can drop our weighted average cost of capital down to 13%. Does that make sense? Okay, just working it the other way. Because what we may find out is that our investors don't need a 26% rate of return. All they need, all they require is a 20% rate of return. And if that's the case, that means we only have to, or we have now a weighted average cost of capital of only 13% instead of 15%. Does that make sense? Now, if we can lower our cost of borrowing, let's say we lower our cost of borrowing from 10% down to 5%. Okay, so that's going to mean this is going to be 3.5. So 3.5 plus 6, we can lower our overall weighted average cost of capital down to 9.5%.
And basically your project has to do better than 9.5
Right.
in order to make money.
In order to make money. At that rate, you'd be breaking even.
Right.
Okay? So the point is, your weighted average cost of capital is totally dependent on your capital stack and on the cost of debt and the required return on equity. And all you're going to, what you're trying to do, okay, think about it like this, and this kind of gets to sort of Jarvis's point. If I am the developer investor, my goal should be sort of twofold. Get my cost of debt as low as I can possibly get it, and maximize my rate of return or my return on equity to my investors. Okay? But we also have to be reasonable about what that rate of return to those investors are, because that may force us, if we set this number too high,
Right.
we're never going to be able to achieve it with the actual project performance.
Right.
Okay? Does that make sense?
Totally.
And it's the whole issue of, and I'm purposely trying to work backwards and forwards with this, because it is sort of an iterative process, meaning that you sort of maybe have a starting point, and then you figure out, okay, well, what adjustments can I possibly make to influence this up or down? Does it make sense? Okay.
I think you already asked it, but the 15%, when you made that, when you set that as the weighted average cost
Right.
of capital, that's the break even. So 26.6 return on equity would be the break even.
Would have been the break even for
15.
the 15.
So that would be the, okay, for the project.
Yep. Now, the break even for the project, we're saying is 9.5%, but that also, that's assuming that our return on equity now is only 20% and our cost of debt's only 5%.
So in other words, if you have a project that your yield, your return is 15%, and you work the numbers, you can give your investors 26.6 return, they'll be happy, but you will never make any money on that project.
That would be the maximum.
Right, that will be the maximum. So you have to promise them less, say 20%, and now you're at 9.5, and the difference between 9.5 and 15 is your profit.
Okay, you're hitting right where I want you to hit, because now let's go over to this example. Okay, if we had an example whereby our capital stack was 100% equity, meaning no debt whatsoever. Okay? And our project was yielding 9.5%. That means that basically this is irrelevant to us, because it's the debt piece. And then we've got to go in, we've got to change this
To 100.
to 100%. Oops. Okay? Which basically means,
Return on investment 15.
no, return on investment is going to be 9.5%.
Right, right.
Because
This is
9.5% is the overall cost, but the debt is irrelevant because we have no debt.
Right.
So all we have left is just the equity side, So 9.5% divided by 100% is gonna give us 9.5%. So our cost or our return on equity is 9.5%. Well now, chances are, we're not gonna be happy with that. Because if we're saying that our investors are demanding at least 20% or 26% or whatever it is in terms of equity, that's the sole reason right there they're not going to do 100% equity deal. Because the only way that they're going to make the return that they want to make is to get that cheap cost of debt.
Right. And even if you gave them all the profits from the project, which is 15%, they will still be at 15% return on equity,
Right,
not the 20.
right.
But isn't there no investors if you're, you have 100%
No.
equity in the?
No, it's all investors.
That's all investors.
Oh, the opposite, I see.
You all get investors.
All investors.
And that's the equity.
I see.
The
Now,
bank
you're
will
not
be
borrowing
your-
anything.
I see.
You're putting in all cash,
Okay.
okay?
Your
Does that
part of
make
that
sense?
might be 2%.
Not me.
As the developer.
Okay. Now let's take this. Okay, so let's say that our before tax cost of debt is 10%, excuse me, is 10%. And our tax rate is 28%. What is our after-tax cost of debt? Remember what we have to do?
10
We're
minus.
gonna take the 10%
Times 72.
times 1 minus the tax rate of 28%, which is 72%. So 72% times 10%, 7.2. Okay, does that make sense? Okay,
When do you usually, when do you want to know that?
I was about to, just
Oh,
about to.
sorry.
Okay, so, once you've calculated basically an after-tax cost of debt, then we could actually put that into sort of our weighted average cost sort of formula, because what we did previously was the before tax.
Before tax.
Okay? So what you can pretty much do is say that if your weighted average cost of capital on a before tax basis is, I was going to pick a number, 15%, then we're sort of saying that our after-tax weighted average cost of capital is pretty much going to be that 15% times 1 minus the tax rate, or basically 10.8% on an after-tax basis. That make sense? Okay. Okay. All right, so we have one more little thing to go over, and then I think we've got it.
What would you call the, if you subtract the after-tax WACC from the after-tax COD, cost of debt, is that number meaningful in any way? Or they're not?
Well, I
really?
mean, in essence, it's going to give you an after-tax return on equity.
Okay.
Is that what you're asking?
No, I was just trying to see if there was a relationship between the after-tax cost of debt of 7.2 and the after-tax WACC of 10.8, which will be roughly 3, 2 point something,
Then you divide that by the percentage equity.
and that would be the return on equity after tax.
Okay. All right. Okay, so the final little calculation, little topic is the mortgage equity approach to valuation. And here, on a relatively simple basis, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, what is the value of the equity within the property? What is the value of the mortgage? And then add them together to come up with an overall valuation, okay? And you're gonna kind of see what we're talking about here as we kind of work through it, all right? So, the variables that you're gonna need to know are basically what's your net operating income. Okay, these are the variables that you're gonna need to know. You're also gonna need to know what is your debt amount. Okay. You're gonna need to know your tax rate. You're gonna need to know the after-tax return on equity, and your interest rate on debt. Okay. So with those variables, we can now come up with what is referred to as the mortgage equity approach to value. All right. So give me an operating income.
100,000.
100,000. Okay, give me a debt. That's gonna be too low. I mean, think of it like this: that in other words, the debt amount, obviously,
500,000.
still probably a little bit low. I would go like $1 million.
Okay.
All right.
I'll play with dough.
If you're gonna go big, man.
Well, no, I mean, think about it. If you're buying a property for $1 million and it's throwing off $100,000 a year in operating income, that's only a 10% return.
We're near 23.
I'm sorry.
We're near 23.
Yeah. Okay. So what interest rate do we want to use for the debt?
7.
We'll split the difference and make 6. Okay. Tax rate, let's say 28%. All right. And then what sort of after-tax return on equity do we want to give our investors?
15.
Okay. Okay. So now we've got all of the variables that we need to actually move forward with this. All right. So here's how it's going to work. You're basically going to get this mortgage equity value. And it's going to be equal to basically your NOI, and then you're going to subtract out from that your annual cost of debt, which is basically going to be your loan amount or debt amount times,
Annual meaning, so.
I'm sorry, not your annual, your total debt amount, brain. Well, actually it is your,
Like that.
let me finish. Trust me, I'm right on this, but I need to fully get my thought out. Okay, you're subtracting out your annual interest expense, and to get that annual interest expense, you're taking your debt amount times your interest rate on that debt. Okay, and then you're going to multiply that by 1 minus the tax rate. That's going to be your numerator for this. Okay? Your denominator for this is going to be your after-tax return on equity. And then you're going to take, once you, excuse me, got all of this, then you're going to add that to your debt amount. Okay, so in one sense, the left-hand side of this is really looking at the equity value. The right-hand side is looking at the debt. Okay, so now let's put the numbers in and see how it works. And it will, I think, make perfect sense to you once we put the numbers in. All right. So in this case, we have an annual net operating income of $150,000.
100.
Oh, sorry, 100.
Okay.
net operating income of $100,000. Our debt is 1 million times our interest rate of 6%, okay, times 1 minus our tax rate of 28%, okay, and then our after-tax return on equity is 15%, and then our total debt amount is 1 million, okay? So those are all the numbers. So let's just sort of walk our way through these. Okay, so we're starting here in the middle. Think about what we're doing, okay? $1 million times 6% is what? Make sure I put the number in right. 1 million times 0.06, 60,000. Okay. So, what we're really doing is we're saying, in terms of, for this particular property, on an annual basis, think about this, on an annual basis, it's generating $100,000 of operating income, yes? But we don't get to keep all that, because we obviously have to pay debt, okay, or pay specifically the cost of interest. So that's the 60,000. Everybody with me still? So 100,000 minus 60,000, that means we have $40,000 of sort of before tax cash flow, so to speak. Yes? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, we've got to convert that to basically after-tax cash flow, thus multiplying it by 1, or multiplying it by 0.72. So what you're going to end up with, just kind of, I'm trying to simplify this, so you basically got 40,000 times 0.72, which is going to be 28,800 divided by 15%, which is going to be 100, I'm losing space here, but basically 192,000 is going to be our equity value added to our mortgage of 1 million. So the total valuation for the property, the mortgage equity valuation, is going to be 1,192,000.
Why the 40,000 instead of?
Wouldn't we multiply the
You need
60,000
another
to the
bracket.
72%
You're missing a
first?
bracket.
You have to multiply first,
And thus?
the 72.
Okay.
Unless there's another bracket.
All right.
Yeah, it's missing.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Order of operations.
It should be 1,378,600.
There we go.
That messed me up. I did the whole problem.
Okay. So once again, you take the 1 million times 6% gives you 60,000. 100,000 minus the 60,000 gives us 40,000. 40,000 times 0.72 gives us the 28.8. All of that divided by the 15% gives us 192,000.
So it's not the 60 times the 70.
No,
Yeah.
100,000 minus
because we're looking at it all, everything on an after-tax basis.
Makes a little difference.
Okay?
So ultimately, what is this answer telling us now?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm jumping.
What the hell is that?
All right. The total value of the property is made up of two components. It's made up of the debt component, it's made up of the equity component. This is simply saying we are looking at the income this property is producing on an annual basis, and we're looking at the debt with respect to what is our interest cost, and we are saying in real time, on an ongoing basis, the value of the equity is $192,000 for this property, added to the existing debt on the property of $1 million. Those two things combined equals the overall value for this property. It is one way to establish a value to the investor for this property. It is not market value. Okay? This is simply a value to the owner of this particular property. what it is worth to them. Okay? Because changing any one of these variables, like for example, if we change what their after-tax rate of return is, that's going to influence how much that equity piece is worth, which is going to either raise or lower the value to them. If they can get a better rate on their interest, that's going to raise or lower the value to them. If they can get a different tax rate, for example, if tax rates get lowered, this is going to have a value increase to them. Okay? So all we're really saying is that at this particular moment in time, that is the value to them. Yep.
I have a couple of questions. So a calculation like this, you will use when? Because it, like you said-
Internally.
Huh?
Internally.
Internally.
Yeah, I mean, it's an internal valuation for you to sort of say, here is a quick and easy, quick and dirty sort of calculation of what the value of the property, is to us internally under the current scenario.
If for example, the market value of that property was below 1.192 million, then,
Well,
then you have a problem.
basically, yeah,
You have a problem.
because what that basically would mean is that you're giving yourself, or you're requiring too high of a return on equity.
Gotcha.
And
Or
you'd have to lower that in order to reflect the market value.
and if you're under, if the market says at 1.5 and you're at 1.92, either you could increase the return to the investors, or you just
If you were to sell it.
If you're selling, or a windfall.
Right.
Sure. Now I have another question on kind of like the same thing. If
No, you're asking the right question, because part of what this is really trying to, the purpose of this is to help you internally to decide, am I way off with respect to what the market value of the property is, and if so, what should I do about it? That under the scenario that you just described, market value, let's say, is 1.5 million, then it's very possible that I internally am saying, well, it's only worth this to me internally.
right,
If this is what I'm really getting on the property internally, then I probably would be a heck of a lot better off selling it for 1.5 million. And pocketing that extra few $100,000 and putting that to a more productive use.
okay. Now my other question has to do with the tax rate. So in a real life scenario where we have, say that we were all investors on a property as a group, that 28%, is that individual to every investor?
Excellent question. No. It's a
Okay,
simple answer.
okay,
Because, because the complex answer is the tax rate's going to be different depending on what other income that you may have as an individual, you know, in terms of your marginal tax rate. And for simplicity purposes, we always just sort of assume everything gets taxed at the marginal tax rate. But the reality is, that's not necessarily the case. Because you have, let's say, one individual over here that maybe other income is $300,000 a year, okay? You have another individual over here that's an investor, equal investor, that maybe their total income is maybe $100,000 a year. And you have another investor that's a retiree that just had a bunch of cash to throw into it, that has maybe $0 of actual real income, that maybe all they've ever done in their life is, for the most part, just trade property, so all they've ever had as an income are capital gains. Okay? Well, all three of those people are going to be taxed at different tax rates. Does that make sense?
yes, so,
But they'll get the same dollar value.
no,
This one is
so
They will each
have a different value for that property.
correct.
So in other words, for the last 2 or 3 weeks we've been talking and playing around with the 28%. If we were actually in a real life case scenario, we will have to do that
Right.
for every investor.
Yes.
And then, even if we were deciding to sell, there might be an investor because of, and this kind of far-fetched, but using the same example, 1.5 million, there might be an investor that because of his tax rate situation, the property is worth to him 1.6, when the market value is 1.5, and you have an investor that the property is worth 1.192, when the property, and he wants to sell, and the other one wants to hold because he's gonna put one. Okay.
and that's actually a perfect segue into next week's topic, which is basically deal structure, okay? Because the whole idea behind deal structure is that everybody potentially wants something different, okay? I mean, you sort of set that up, I think, quite nicely. It could be Jarvis, all Jarvis is maybe interested in is current operating income, that the property throws off each and every year, and he's gonna live off of that, exclusively off of that operating income. Michael, has no desire to have any operating income whatsoever off of his investments. He wants everything to come in as one lump sum sort of capital gain, 10 years from now, okay? And, you have somebody else that maybe wants a hybrid of the two, But then you also have a situation of, well, the amount of money that Jarvis puts in is not necessarily going to be the same amount of money that Michael puts in. Or their tax rates are not going to be different. Or their expectations of when they get paid back may vary. That it may be that whatever dollar amount Jarvis puts in, he wants to get paid back as soon as he possibly can, whereas Michael may be more patient about being paid back and is willing to defer, for several years into the future before he sees a dime. That's where deal structure comes in.
Right.
But all of that has to be established up front.
Right.
Because if you don't establish it up front, then that's where the conflict is going to come into play. That everybody needs to know how much they have to put in, when they're going to get paid, how much they're going to get paid, in what priority are they going to be paid. Same thing goes for the developer. Because the developer and the investor may be two totally different people. The developer may be you're doing all the work in terms of the day-to-day operational sort of stuff. These guys are just money guys, and they're basically just saying, here's a big pile of money, go make us more money, here's how we want to be paid, here's when we want to be paid, here's kind of the rate of return that we demand, and then you're sort of on your own as to, figuring out, well, when you're going to get paid. Are you going to be paid a fee? Are you going to be paid a percentage of profits? Are you going to be paid basically off of the capital gain? How much of that is going to come from one versus the other? And so we're going to establish. So next week, bring your laptops, because this is where we're going to have to use Excel. Okay. Otherwise, we'll spend the whole class period on one problem. Okay. Because it's going to be that complex.
Would you say this formula is better used when evaluating whether or not to purchase a property, rather than when you've already held it? Because that's like you can evaluate it for return on equity.
It can be both. It can be both.
I'm trying to see, like, when you're owning it. Because yes, I have a market value of 1.192, but if I'm holding it, what does it mean to me? Like, even internally, I'm not.
Well, it means that you're trying to make decisions. I mean, this whole chapter, to a certain extent, was: do we own it? Do we potentially sell it? Do we lease it? Do we, what is the value internally to you, and what decisions should you make with this sort of data? And what I'm saying to you is, one of the ways that you're going to use this is you're going to sort of say, okay, well, what is the value that it's showing, and do I think that is anywhere close to reality in terms of the market value? And if it's way out of whack, then what should I do about that? Should I basically continue to own the property? Should I sell it? Should I maybe renovate it? Should I, what should I do? That's all that we're trying to give you, some different metrics to sort of look at the property maybe a little bit differently. Because you can go through, to a certain extent, this just sort of shortcuts the process a little bit off of, you're doing almost the same exact thing when you're creating an operating statement. Right. This is just sort of trying to put it in a nice little tidy framework where you can look at just a few key pieces of information and not have to have all of the other stuff right in front of you. Okay, but yes, you're right, you could use it on an acquisition in the sense that making all those assumptions and then say, okay, well, that's the value that it would have to me.
Right, because if the market value is, if you're paying more than that comes out, then you're not going to get your return on equity.
Right.
So you got to try and go back, get a lower interest rate for the bank or something.
Right.
That was the question.
All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right, we got a couple little quizzes. Those are on the way.
We take a break.
Looking around after.
Let's see here.
We have the quizzes and that's it? Then it's the quizzes and then, okay.
So take a 5-minute break.
Sure will.
Ready to know?
Red Bull.
Double tap one. Go man.
Yeah. I didn't do shit, but I'm sore. Because you're old, you're getting old. I hired a moving company, it still cost me $2 grand. But I'm not that kind of guy that can sit around and watch everybody work.
Me too.
You know why?
I have to, so I drink also.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Don't eat any meat, man. Baby's supposed to go away. No red meat. Tell you, my daughter had some red meat yesterday.
So which, why are you gonna start, so we can see the grade?
No, you're gonna have to use for quiz 4.
Ah, yeah. I was like,